So I'm outside Highgate Cemetery. That's the west side. And the east side is just there. So this will be my second visit to Highgate. It's quite far from where I live, but it is definitely worth the travel. It's a beautiful place. So this beautiful cemetery is a place of burial in North London, England. There are approximately 170,000 people buried in around 53,000 graves across the West and East Cemeteries. Highgate is notable both for some of the people buried there as well as for its de facto status as a nature reserve. Due to a population increase and lack of burial space in London in the early 1800s, Parliament passed a statute for 7 new private cemeteries to be opened in the countryside around the capital. Highgate was one of those cemeteries and opened in 1839. 15 acres were consecrated for the use of members of the Church of England and 2 acres set aside for the dissenters, basically people who were not Church of England. Rights of burial were granted for either a limited period or in perpetuity, i.e. technically forever. The first burial, on the 26th of May 1839, was Elizabeth Jackson, aged 36, of Little Windmill Street, Soho. The location of the cemetery and the stunning views meant that the wealthy would be encouraged to invest. The millionaire newspaper owner Julius Beer was one such investor. He built the cemetery's most impressive monument for his 8-year-old daughter Ada. You'll see that monument a little bit further along in the video. Highgate attracted a varied clientele and over the next 20 years after opening became one of the capital's most fashionable cemeteries. In 1854, the London Cemetery Company was so profitable that the cemetery was extended by a further 20 acres on the other side of its Swains Lane site. The new ground is now commonly known as the East Cemetery. That was opened in 1856. The first burial in the new ground took place on the 12th of June 1860, and that was Mary Ann Webster, the 16-year-old daughter of a local baker. A tunnel beneath Swains Lane connected the new ground with the Church of England chapel in the older west side, and with the aid of a hydraulic lift, coffins would descend into the tunnel and remain on cemetery ground for their passage to the other half of the cemetery. This tunnel is no longer in use, which is a shame, as it would have been pretty cool to walk through it. Although some wealthy families continued to purchase select rights of burial into the 1930s, Highgate Cemetery was passing into a long-term decline, with less expensive and more common graves being the main options. Greater number of graves were abandoned as families died out or moved away and maintenance became minimal. In 1956, in an attempt to raise much needed income, the cemetery sold off its stonemason's yard along with the superintendent's house. The two chapels were also closed in the same year. The London Cemetery Company was finally declared bankrupt in 1960. The company was absorbed into the larger United Cemetery Company, for which the next 15 years struggled to keep the cemetery afloat. Funds eventually ran out and the gates were closed. The cemetery faced a bleak and uncertain future. Much is said about the state of some areas of the cemetery, but in 1975 the Friends of Highgate Cemetery was formed with the aim to promote the conservation of the cemetery. Work began to clear through the overgrown landscape and repair some of the memorials which had been damaged by vandals during the cemetery's decline. Since then, an increasing amount of restoration and conservation work has been carried out. The Egyptian Avenue, Circle of Lebanon and the Terrace Catacomb, along with over 70 other monuments, have now been listed by English Heritage, over double that number having had attention and maintenance. There's definitely some impressive buildings within the cemetery. The Tudor Gothic style building at the entrance contains two chapels, one for the Church of England and the other for the Dissenters. During 2011, the chapel interior was restored to its 1880s colour scheme and reopened for funerals. English Heritage has listed Highgate Cemetery as Grade 1 park. Both sides of the cemetery remain open as active burial grounds with interments taking place weekly. So much of the cemetery has been restored, but it's definitely a work in progress. The Friends rely on the entrance charges you pay to enable them to maintain and enhance Highgate Cemetery. Unlike most cemeteries, they are not run or funded by a local council. All the funds raised are used for the preservation of the cemetery. They do not make a profit. The Friends state their aims are to preserve Highgate Cemetery as a place of historic and other interest and beauty, to permit the cemetery to be used as a public burial ground, and to secure the repair, restoration and preservation of the cemetery for public benefit. The Friends are all volunteers. They keep the site running. They guide tours, tend the landscape, help out with events, welcome visitors and a whole lot more than that. Egyptian Avenue is a structure consisting of 16 vaults on either side of a broad passageway. This is entered via a great arch. These vaults were fitted with shelves for 12 coffins and were purchased by individual families for their sole use. So it's a Circle of Lebanon. Apparently a filming location. Fantastic beasts. Egyptian Avenue leads to the Circle of Lebanon, which was built in the same style and consisted of 20 vaults on the inner circle with a further 16 added in the 1870s, built in the classical style. I have to say, and as bizarre as it seems, that this is probably my most favourite area in the West Cemetery at Highgate. So this is the monument I spoke about earlier. Julius Beer had this built for his young daughter Ada. It's a magnificent building, I have to say. Above the Circle of Lebanon is a separate Gothic-style catacomb named the Terrace Catacombs and was completed in 1842. This area was really, really dark and quite eerie. Tom Sayers, bare knuckle fighter. That's his dog Lion. You can join the Friends of Highgate, £20 a year. All that money goes towards the upkeep and maintenance. I've done it because this is a historic place and there's just not enough money and not enough volunteers to do what needs doing. So if you live in London, you're retired perhaps, or you're a craftsman of some sort, there's so much need doing here. Definitely a story there. He meant well. This is the unmarked grave of about 10 persons called the Lost Girls. So the Lost Girls are 10 prostitutes, the youngest only 12 years old, and they have laid forgotten in the unmarked grave at Highgate West Cemetery for more than a century. There is an article by Rowan Lennon and Sam Perrin online. It gives you the whole story about how they came to be there and who they were and what that was all about. It's worth looking up. Interesting read. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel.